It's now my pleasure to introduce perhaps America's foremost expert on walkability. Jeff Speck's latest book is Walkable Cities: How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. And backing up and a little bit of personal history between Jeff and myself, I met Jeff probably 10, 12 years ago when I didn't have much information or knowledge or even really have developed an opinion on subjects like walkability. In Oklahoma City, where I grew up, we drove. And that just seemed to be the way it is. And I realized upon examination and in looking at the obesity rates in my city that the built environment was a significant problem that had helped us lead to this kind of unhealthy culture, and the built environment needed to be changed. Well, easier said than done. I mean, changing the built environment kind of seems like one of the largest obstacles you could possibly create for yourself. But I knew the first thing we had to do is kind of talk to our citizens and even let them know we had a problem. Because if you live in Oklahoma City and you drive your car, you probably didn't notice that there was absolutely no way to walk across the street in downtown Oklahoma City safely. Or did people consider downtown even a place where they might want to experience or stay longer than they had to? When a position is not pedestrian friendly, people tend to see how fast they can leave that place or how fast they can get in and out of it. And so Oklahoma City was probably an extreme example. I think there was probably some reluctance on Jeff even to look at Oklahoma City because, there's just so much you can do, to a place when it wants to do better, but the challenge is so large. How do you piece it together? But I want to say I give Jeff a lot of credit in coming into our city, kind of serving as the change agent, not only helping me to identify the problem, but being able to defend the reasons for changing it, the successes that would occur if it could be successfully changed. And then ultimately, I think we became creative and found ways to fund a complete reformation of our downtown area. So Jeff's work in Oklahoma City is extraordinary, but he has also duplicated this success in his private business in cities and towns, medium size, small size, large size, all across the country. So he was very generous to give us his time to come in today and to kind of walk us through some of the changes he sees that are necessary in America if we hope to create the pedestrian-friendly communities that we desire. We also know that with the autonomous vehicle and its implementation, that's also going to affect city planning, and people that are experts on downtown and walkability like Jeff Speck obviously have opinions in this area about the steps we ought to be looking forward to as we prepare for the autonomous age that's upon us. So with that, please welcome Jeff Speck to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Well, thank you, Mayor Cornett. It's an honor to be introduced by you again, and to a group that I've wanted to talk to since 2004 when I attended my very first winter meeting here. At that time, I was representing the National Endowment for the Arts, and I heard Mayor Riley talk about the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Helping run that program over 4 years, including through Hurricane Katrina, was how I got to know and admire Tom Cochran and Tom McClyman, who I'd also like to thank for including me today. Can I interrupt to say this is my first time on a teleprompter ever, and I'm a little nervous about it. But I have like an hour and a half of speech for you, and to do it in 20 minutes, which I will, to do it in 20 minutes, I needed to write it down. But if it's at any comfort, I wrote the script myself at the Winter White House in Mar-a-Lago. So my brief talk today is called Autonomous Vehicles and the Good City, 10 Rules for Mayors. And I should say I was asked to talk about autonomous vehicles because I heard this is something you all want to hear more about. And I know in my conversations with cities, after we stop talking about parking, which is what everyone talks about, we move right on to autonomous vehicles and what do they mean for our cities. So I put this together just for you all. Before I let Mayor Cornett off the hook, I should put a little meat on the bones of our relationship because I learned some lessons in Oklahoma City that helped me think about the problem of self-driving cars. Mostly that the car is a great servant but a brutal master. When Mayor Cornett was new to office, Oklahoma City was named by Prevention Magazine as the least walkable city in America. And rather than letting that stick, Mayor Cornett and his team, with my help, launched an effort to rebuild all 40 blocks of streets in their downtown core. I had found that many of the driving lanes just weren't needed. And by right-sizing the streets to meet the real demand, we were able to calm traffic, double the amount of on-street parking, and add a ton of trees and create a robust cycling network where there had been none before. And 10 years later, this is the project that I'm still the most proud of. I also want to acknowledge all the other mayors still in office who I've worked for in the last decade. I know at least some of you are here today, so thanks. And I also would acknowledge the mayors like Mayor Kotz, who I met through the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Who here has participated in a Mayor's Institute on City Design? If you haven't, look to the person near you whose hand is up and ask them about it, because it's really a fantastic program that you would all enjoy a lot. I learn more from mayors than from anyone else, and I can say with some confidence that I've learned from the best. I'm also grateful to Ford for sponsoring this meeting. Almost coincidentally, I gave a Ford-sponsored TED Talk 2 weeks ago at the Detroit Auto Show. The highlight there was a dinner picking the brains of Jim Hackett and Laura Merling, who are leading Ford's autonomous vehicles effort. I hope the Ford representatives here today are not disappointed by my talk. Hi, Jessica, wherever you are. But in case they are, I want to make it clear that while I see as much danger as promise in AVs, what I saw over that dinner was two leaders with a profound sense of corporate responsibility who want to see their technology have the most positive impact on America and the world. Ford is trying to do the right thing. But I will make clear in the next 20 minutes it's not going to be easy. For them and for us, the city with AVs, if the city with AVs is to be better than the city without them, then there's a lot of work to be done. In a sense, this is speculative fiction, but we city planners and transportation planners have been talking about this now for several years, and with their help, I've come up with 10 rules that I think are likely to be essential if we're to benefit from this technology. Especially helpful to me were Paul Moore of Nelson Nygaard, which is America's best transportation planning firm by a long shot, and Jarrett Walker, the author of the wonderful book Human Transit, and one of our leading transportation thinkers. Here's what we came up with. Number one, be afraid. One of my favorite books of all time is by the philosopher Neil Postman. It's called Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. In it, Postman describes what he calls the technological imperative, which means, at least to me, that new technologies that increase convenience are unstoppable, whatever their impact on our long-term quality of life. It happened with our cars. Enthusiastic adoption, followed by some dubious outcomes. These include the doubling of the percentage of our income that we spend on transportation to travel no faster in cities than we used to with a horse and buggy. The drowning of our coastal cities from climate change. The transformation of so much of the American public realm into an unmitigated soul-sucking eyesore. The mortification of our bodies through inactivity, brought on by the elimination of the useful walk, as Mayor Cornett talked about, and the loss, at last count, of 38,000 American lives each year in car crashes. Now, none of this was planned. The technology won, and it will again. This last item represents, for many of us, the key argument in favor of autonomous vehicles. If adopted en masse, they will save hundreds of thousands of lives, so many that the organ donation industry is worried. Additionally, we can expect that so much urban land will be made available for other uses since we no longer will need as much parking. You will no longer need to pay your parking fee before existing. That seems to have no downside. But as I will try to show, these two positives can very quickly be offset if we're not careful. That leads to rule number 2, be realistic, which I'm also calling what to expect when you're expecting AVs. That reminds us that major change is unlikely to happen within a decade or several. I don't know how long you plan on being mayor, but it's likely to not happen. It's likely to happen after that. Notice even that Ford, in this vision that they produced, is talking about decades and decades from now. Other industry experts think that full autonomy actually won't happen at all. And that's a problem because most of the benefits of AVs only really kick in once we have full autonomy, a swarming fleet of shared vehicles that operates as a public good. This challenge was well described by Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar, who describes autonomy as a heaven or hell scenario. Heaven is fleets of shared electric driverless cars powered by renewable energy, and a more socialist wealth distribution system to help all the drivers put out of work buy those cars. Hell, on the other hand, is privately owned AVs that, since they have nowhere to park, spend much of the day circling, doubling the traffic load. Now, I'm only 53, but I've been an American long enough to know that a fleet of publicly owned AVs does not constitute freedom. We have shown at the national and state levels absolutely zero propensity to control how people buy or use their cars. European cities, like Barcelona, might create large car-free zones or close 2/3 of their streets to through traffic, but not even New York City was able to pull off congestion-based toll pricing. So in terms of ownership, do you actually think someone's going to tell that dude from the Cadillac EV commercial that he can't have his own AV and take it wherever he wants, whenever he wants? I don't. So suddenly swarming becomes almost impossible, and this guy can still run his Mercedes through Des Moines at Mach 2.5, even if he's slaloming through AVs the whole way, which he might very well hit. So perhaps the lives saved by AVs won't be as many as we anticipate. A realistic understanding of what AVs are likely to mean in America leads to many of the rules that follow, including Rule 3, decide how much traffic you want. This is probably the key rule because a simple understanding of economics makes it hard to avoid reaching the conclusion that AVs will result in a ton more driving. If they cut the cost of driving by 80% as anticipated, that's supposed to add 60% more trips to city streets that are already at capacity. That's what's got Mayor Bloomberg up in arms and pointing the way towards a lot of regulation, intervention, and new policy to avert disaster. But it's actually worse than 60% for a number of reasons. The biggest one is called induced traffic, or the fundamental law of traffic congestion. If you ignore induced demand, 60% more trips are not a problem, as long as we have swarming. Elon Musk tells us that a driving lane full of swarming AVs can handle 3 times as many cars as it does today. So problem solved, until you realize that these days traffic congestion is the principal constraint to driving. Because driving is already so subsidized, we do it as much as we can unless we're punished by traffic. Induced traffic is why highway expansions never work. Traffic engineering theory is straightforward. A street is congested because the number of drivers, shown here in yellow, exceeds its capacity. If you enlarge the street, you will eliminate congestion. Unfortunately, what happens instead is that the number of drivers quickly increases to match the increased capacity, and congestion returns in full force. These are the drivers who are taking transit, carpooling, commuting off-peak, or simply not driving because they didn't want to be stuck in traffic. When the traffic went away, they changed their habits. Maybe they moved further away from work as the time cost of their commute went down. Unfortunately, thanks to them and others like them, it couldn't last. This law applies to city streets as well as highways, and it's particularly bad in third world countries where the poor have lots of time and the rich have drivers so they can get stuff done while they're stuck in traffic. This becomes especially alarming when we realize that AVs will make driving cheaper in 2 ways, money and time. You will pay less per mile, and you won't mind sitting in gridlock as you work or watch cat videos. What to do about this huge likely increase in vehicles? The only answer, I believe, is to regulate it, not with laws, but with lanes. Without a commitment to limiting capacity, all our parking lanes, soon empty, will not become bike lanes and greenways as promised, but more driving lanes, and sidewalks will feel miserable. The right solution is to make the streets what you want them to be. Since cars will be more efficient, you can commit to no increase in driving lanes, maybe even get rid of a bunch. You can convert parking lanes to bike lanes and to express bus lanes, which will still be needed as the AVs reach their natural state of equilibrium, which we know from the law of induced traffic will be congestion. Making the streets we want was a hallmark of the Bloomberg administration, where Jeanette Sadiq-Khan oversaw the creation of an amazing bike network and many great public spaces by putting driving lanes to better use. This is what Mayor Bloomberg means when he says the battle is to create a space in which the question is not how we get ready for self-driving cars, but rather what kind of city we want. Rule number 4 is the other natural outcome of cheaper cars, which is plan for more sprawl pressure. I recently saw this ad in a kiosk in Boston's Copley Square, and my heart fell out of my chest. Here was a Lyft ad ostensibly for last-mile service complementing our rail network. But I'll be darned if it wasn't an exact map of suburban sprawl. Now, I've been fighting sprawl for nearly a quarter century with limited success, and everyone knows that it's a function of 4 main factors: highways, mortgage programs, local subsidies, and racism. But mostly highways. Before the car, land development was mostly nodal, mostly around rail stops, and therefore walkable. Only with the car did the entire landscape become equivalent, and development began to take the wasteful and unwalkable, disconnected forms that now, more than anything else, characterize the American landscape. But there is recent good news, if learning that you have a crippling disease can be called good news, which is that the cities and towns have begun to figure out that sprawl does not pay for itself. As many of you with sprawling cities can attest, the tax revenue from low-density sprawl is not enough to replace roads and pipes once they fail. For this reason, we can hope that the next great inducement to national sprawl, cheap autonomous automobiles, will not have as great an impact as universal car ownership did. But this is only a hope, which is why this may be the one category where policy may be the most needed. Given national and state-level tendencies, this policy can mostly only happen at the local level, which is why I would direct you to Smart Growth America, the nonprofit agency that is your best resource for smart growth policy. Rule number 5 is understand transit geometry. It has come to the attention of many of us in this business that most of the discussion around AVs seems to adhere to only to some of the laws of physics. What is often misunderstood is simple geometry, how many people fit in a vehicle. Even if they swarm and are small, AVs are cars, and since they'll be used by Americans, most can be expected to hold only one rider. Here are 200 people in 177 cars. They fill the street to the horizon. Here they are on bikes, here they are on buses, and here they are in a streetcar. There's no getting around the fact that low-occupancy vehicles are a tremendous waste of street space. It doesn't matter if the vehicle is conventional, electric, or autonomous. Geometry prevails. This is why, when the Brooklyn Bridge was converted from part rail to all car in 1948, it went from carrying 400,000 people a day to carrying only 170,000 people a day. It's why a single L train in New York carries as many people per hour as 2,000 cars, and an articulated bus equals 100 cars. Autonomous cars are a great supplement to transit, but in congested places, they are not a solution to transit. That's why Ford is also investing in autonomous buses. Which leads to Rule 6, don't rob transit. This may be the greatest risk. In congested cities, replacing trains and buses with autonomous cars will cripple mobility. Now, if you're a city with no congestion, a very small transit population, too, AVs may present a solution. If you are Davenport, Iowa, my wife's hometown, moving your transit investment into a voucher system may eventually make sense. But if you're Des Moines or even Iowa City, it does not make sense. Unfortunately, just the prospect of future AVs is already threatening transit investment in certain American cities. The Mountain View City Council just voted down dedicated BRT lanes on El Camino Real, due in part to the expectations of AVs making buses obsolete. The Michigan's Taxpayer Alliance and others are picking up on AVs and Uber as the last great weapon to finally kill transit, and even DC's Metro is threatened. Meanwhile, Uber, unlike Lyft, has set its sights on transit and is offering Uber Pool monthly memberships at a lower cost than transit memberships, passes in some places, and some say that's to put the conventional transit system out of business. Uber admits that this pricing is well below cost and unsustainable, And that, by definition, is predatory. So as city leaders, mayors have a responsibility to teach their citizens about geometry, to teach them what even Elon Musk doesn't seem to know, which is that a shift from transit to AV cars represents a reduction in mobility. Rule 7, own the streets and the data. It sounds implausible, but there is a very real worry that AV providers will ask to buy certain city streets or certain segments of city streets, and cities will take the money. This has precedents, like Chicago leasing its on-street parking to Morgan Stanley for 75 years, and these precedents are all regretted. We need to remember that your city's streets are its principal public spaces, and especially downtown, they perform many more jobs than just moving vehicles. They're places to walk, bike, access buildings, dine, converse, grow trees, protest, and much more, and they belong to us all. I particularly like this quote that Adam Gopnik recently wrote in The New Yorker. Cities are their streets. Streets are not a city's veins, but it's neurology, it's accumulated intelligence. You mustn't sell that. Getting more wonky for a minute, the other big issue on ownership, already a big deal, has to do with traffic data collected by Uber, which cities can benefit from in many ways. For example, knowing which way to send a fire truck. Jeanette Sadiq-Khan is one of many who take issue correctly with Uber's very partial data sharing. Like Uber's, AVs will represent a viable business model only by running on public streets. Sharing full data would seem a small price to pay for that privilege. Now, here's my favorite rule, rule number 8. Don't buy any urban vision that forgets urbanism. If you study modern urban history, you will see that every major transportation advance has brought with it whole new concepts of what the city is. We are a creative species, and we can't help but use any excuse to reinvent the human habitat. The problem is that all these inventions, from Le Corbusier's tower in the park to Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, have turned out to make our lives worse, and we've had to come crawling back from them. What works best for humans is this traditional city of streets, blocks, and squares. It has survived largely unchanged for millennia, and for good reason. Traditional urbanism was not an invention, but evolved naturally in response to the human needs, and the adoption of AVs should not allow us to replace it with something different. If Jessica from Ford will forgive me, I'm going to return to this image, which discusses the improved walkability of the AV-enabled city. Well, you know, I wrote the book on walkability, and if you think about it, you'll agree that nobody willingly walks on an empty, windswept highway overpass. Similarly, nobody walks, here barely visible at the center, between boring bushes and a 6-lane highway. This is where people walk, and it hasn't changed for 3,000 years. So we can't let the AVs trick us into thinking anything different. Rule 9, unify around set policy demands. As we wind up this list, let's move forward into action. I'm so excited to be giving this talk to this group because you all have the power, if you act collectively, to determine the future. As I've suggested, there are a number of ways that cities will need to regulate AVs if they're to be a boon and not a bane. These include owning the data, protecting transit, prohibiting empty circling trips, setting speed limits, and the like. City by city, you each have almost no sway here, especially if you're acting in competition to see who can get the AVs first so you can all be cool like Pittsburgh. But working together, you can't be denied. Collectively, you can all create a protocol that you present to AV providers as a collective requirement. Such an effort has already begun at NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They have some sway, but they don't own the streets like you do. NACTO's list is a good start, but it needs refinement and expansion. Where better to center such an effort than at the U.S. Conference of Mayors? Could this be your next task force? If you do it, I'll be glad to help. Finally, Rule 10, invest now in the current technological revolution. Now, I'll admit here that I cheated a bit. I'm a city planner. I'm not an AV expert. It's not often that a city planner gets to give a talk to this many mayors at once, so I couldn't resist bringing up what I call the biggest city planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. It's a transportation revolution. It's upon us now rather than in 2030 or beyond. like AVs. What if I were to tell you that there was a transportation technology available now that outperformed AVs by almost every measure, that traveled 50 to 80 times further per calorie expended than the automobile, that required very little space, that could drive on existing infrastructure with minimal modification, that didn't pollute, that made its users healthier, happier, and skinnier? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that technology exists, and more than half of you own it already. It's called a bicycle. And while the bicycle is not new, what is new to the U.S. is a whole bunch of new, great bike infrastructure, like the protected bike lane, that has been shown to be much more effective than conventional bike lanes at growing cycling populations. When a protected bike lane was inserted in Brooklyn's Prospect Park West, the number of cyclists tripled, speeding went from 75% of all users to 17%, injury crashes to all users dropped by 63%, and there was no negative impact on the road capacity for cars, even though it lost a lane. There was, of course, a lawsuit, this being New York, but it's over now. Protected bike lanes are what you need to give a sense of security to the civilian bicyclist. Without them, all you get is mammals, middle-aged men in Lycra. With them, you get millennials, you get tech companies, and you get these folks. This picture was taken 1 block east of here on the 15th Street protected bike lane, a place that you should visit. And with a lot of good bike lanes, you get Copenhagen, where 4 times as many people bike than drive. Imagine that. And we're talking about autonomous vehicles. Why? Tom and Tom, forgive me, excuse me. Jessica from Ford, forgive me. But autonomous vehicles are the right answer to the wrong question. Why do we all, even MIT's Media Lab and Google, keep asking how we can make cars better? Where has that ever gotten us? The proper question is, how can we provide the most useful mobility to the most people with the most positive outcomes for society? The answer includes cars, but it also includes trains, buses, bikes, and walking, especially biking and especially walking. If you guys ever invite me back again after this, I would love to talk to you about that. If any of you want to continue this conversation, I can be reached at jeffspeck.com. There's a handout you all have that summarizes this talk. Also, I teach a 2-day course at Harvard every summer, and I would love to see some of you there. This year, it is June 22nd through 23rd. And, of course, I'm on Twitter, Jeff Speck, AICP. I would love to talk to some of you there. Thank you all so much for listening. Thanks again to Mayor Cornett for the invitation. Thank you.
Well, I've always believed that a good speaker can inform, interpret, and entertain. And I think Jeff Speck deserves another round of applause for hitting all 3 of those points. Thank you very much.